This is our last event in the speaker series for spring 2015, and because we had to reschedule it from earlier in the semester, we lost our access to the auditorium, so this is the one time when we're filling up the room, and it's good, but hopefully we won't have too many more that have to come in. I want to welcome David Mitchell from the University of Missouri Law School, but before that, I want to point our attention to something that's happened in our own state here in South Carolina that's gotten a lot of national news. And actually, one of our faculty in communication studies has written an essay, some of you may have seen it, that was on NPR yesterday. And actually, it was the most downloaded essay from NPR today. And it's called At Walter Scott's Funeral, An Unexpected Conversation. So you all know who Walter Scott is. He was the unarmed African-American man in his 50s, I believe, in North Charleston, who was shot and killed by a police officer last week for a routine traffic stop. So we've seen a lot of that this year. We've seen Ferguson, we've seen it in Staten Island, we've seen it in Cleveland, we've seen it now here in South Carolina. It's not new, but the attention that's being put on it is kind of new. But I want to read a passage from the essay that Chenjerai wrote because it's relevant to us as planning faculty, planning students, and future planning professionals. And I'll just say that he and his wife went down to the funeral in North Charleston, and they were kind of just outsiders. They wanted to go and pay their respects. And when you go to a thing like this, you end up, people ask you why they're there, and start up conversations with some of the family and friends. And so he started up a conversation with a woman in her 70s who was, a local and either a friend or a distant family member of the deceased. And she told him, she said, Clemson is a good university, she said, in a kind of firm way that signaled a but coming. But it's hard for young folk like my kin to get in, she said. She told me she's been noticing Clemson students moving in for a new wave of high-paying jobs that have been coming to North Charleston. I see those Clemson flags in my backyard, she says. She's talking about gentrification, of course. North Charleston is a far cry from the growing economies of Greenville and Columbia, but in recent years, new industries and malls have started to slowly attract college graduates to the area. Some of my students will likely be among them, and their arrival will transform the business, cultural, and political landscape here. It's also likely to raise rents and over time displace folks like this grandmother and her family. Now, perhaps it seems odd to meditate on gentrification with a body not 10 feet away, the sound of recorded gunshots still ringing in all our ears. But as NPR's Martin Cassidy reported last week, black lawmakers brought it up at press conference outside of North Charleston's shiny new city hall. They talked about body cameras, but also about how poor black residents here have been getting shuffled around for decades. When the city of Charleston gentrified in the 1980s, those folks were squeezed into North Charleston. They're getting out now with the new malls and industries creeping into North Charleston. They're getting elbowed out again. So I encourage you to just download this very brief article, but it sort of points us to the importance of planning and some of the things that we do in our daily professional lives and in our research and sort of what we tend to think about, and how it links to some of these actually very current issues around policing, around communities, around what David's going to talk about in incarceration and prisoner reentry into communities. These are the communities that we're concerned with, and this is the topic in a lot of African Americans and Latino communities. It's not that planners don't have anything to say about it. Planners may not be interested in police, but certainly the issues around gentrification, the issues around neighborhood equality, around the concentration of poverty are something that planners are centrally focused on. So it's kind of a timely moment, and in some ways, this event sadly offers another piece of discussion, which we can talk with David about from his perspective as a lawyer and as a sociology scholar, looking at criminal justice, about these links between planning and criminal justice in communities. So with that, I want to introduce David Mitchell. He's a professor of law at the University of Missouri Law School. He's been there since 2006. Before that, he was a scholar in residence at the Department of Sociology at the University of Colorado Boulder, with a doctorate in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a law degree from UPenn. His dissertation was titled Unintended Consequences in the Interdisciplinary Exploration of the Obstacles that Prevent Successful Ex-Offender Reentry and Reintegration and the Societal Impact. He's also an affiliate member of the Missouri University Black Black Studies program and a policy research scholar with the Missouri University Institute for Public Policy, something that I think Clemson really could benefit from some public policy analysis as well. And interestingly, and perhaps a point of conversation later on in the talk, he was appointed as the chair of the Missouri State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Now that's a particularly interesting position given the events at Ferguson, Missouri over this past year. So with that, why don't you help me welcome David to Clemson and hear what he has to say.
Thank you very much. I certainly want to thank Dr. Spencer for the invitation. The last time I was in South Carolina actually was last summer. My family, we drove to see some family members down in Pineville. We went to Charleston. All right, they got their first experience. We could see the downtown. And having read not just the police reports, but the statements about the difference between North Charleston and Charleston proper and how they are so fundamentally different in the eyes of sort of most folks. Dr. Spencer and I, what he failed to tell you is that we were both on the track team together in New York City. He stayed in much better shape than I have. But this was in the age that many students will probably not realize. We actually ran on a cinder track, sort of like Chariots of Fire without the movie, right? So. In any event, I want to thank you so much for the invitation. As I was preparing my talk sort of last week and before, and this was before Walter Scott was shot, I was sort of like, oh, what am I going to talk about? Decoding sort of, citizen, police, law enforcement interaction, and then this happened. And I was like, wow, how both untimely and timely, and how both unfortunate to sort of have that circumstance. So, a historic moment occurred in 2008. Right? The election of the first African-American president, and so regardless of your political ideology, Republican, Democrat, independent, apathetic, it was indeed a moment of history, okay? So we joined the pantheon of nations in effect in which a person of color was elected to lead the country, all right? We crossed the color barrier in this particular way, and maybe in 2016, the United States will cross another barrier, the gender barrier, right? We'll see what happens in that election. Who knows? Many thought that, of course, by his election, that we had solved, if you will, a problem, an answer, or we had answered W.E.B. Du Bois's notion that, in effect, the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line, okay? In fact, folks said, we are now in a post-racial society, right? A good deal of my friends that evening heralded the moment, and I heralded the moment too. It was historic, and yet I recall that evening, and I said to them, his election is indeed historic, and yet it's still not going to do a great deal to change racial profiling or African Americans and their interactions with law enforcement, and alas, that prediction has sadly come true. All right, it hasn't changed a great deal. And I'm not really sure we should put that all on President Obama to say that he was going to be elected and we would forget sort of a history of our nation as we sort of move forward. And so, excuse me, so when I think about this, I think about the words that the Attorney General said, in 2009, when he said that we are a nation of cowards when it deals with issues of race, right? It's find it difficult to address this past. And so I'm hoping that today that we are not cowards, that we will engage in a brave discussion that most folks do not have, right? That we actually engage and grapple with these issues of race as they play out with respect to law enforcement and in our communities. And as urban planners, of course, and as city planners, that is always present. I come from New York City, a city in which Columbia University has gentrified my old neighborhood, has pushed out its former residents who were primarily African American and immigrants from the Dominican Republic, and it's replaced them with professors and college students and new businesses, okay? But sadly, I haven't been in New York for quite some time either. So I still claim New York as my status, but I'm really a Missouri resident. And so, all right. And so as I sort of talk about this, so the topic is decoding citizen law enforcement interaction, the continued salience of race and place, right? And this issue deals with the relationship in which law enforcement, particularly deal with citizens of color, right? Or particularly citizens of color. And of course, it's the hot button issue these days, okay? It's become a lightning rod issue. It's divisive. It's an emotionally charged issue, right? And it's a difficult discussion, but one we need to have. So, perceptions. That's where we shall begin, with perceptions. So in order to truly understand the nature of law enforcement and citizen interactions, it is necessary to recognize that these perceptions are based upon both unconscious and conscious actions, otherwise known as racial scripts, historical and contemporary narratives drawn from both individual and collective lived experiences. All right? That's how we engage and walk through our sort of interactions. So In fact, I would posit that at the moment of any interaction between a citizen and a law enforcement individual, there is a backdrop that already exists. Right? We often focus on the moment itself, and yet the moment is not really defining. Right? Because in effect, there was a script that already existed prior to that interaction. You can count it in North Charleston, in Ferguson, Missouri, in Cleveland, Ohio, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, wherever. That is merely one sort of, if you will, point in time of the entire context in and of itself. All right, so racial scripts, what are they? A racial script is, quote, a series of programmed messages, for example, stereotypes and myths about a particular race or ethnic group, and is transmitted to children by parents, relatives, teachers, media, religious groups, and significant others. Parents may not deliberately indoctrinate their children with a particular racist view. The children's racial attitudes invariably might be indirectly influenced by parental example and by beliefs. Okay? Now, I say racial scripts because that's sort of the continued salience portion of my talk. Yet we can substitute ethnicity, right, for race. We can substitute gender, and we can even substitute socioeconomic class, right, socioeconomic status. Right? They're all scripts upon which we act upon, which we gain our information from our folks, and from other sort of methods of socialization. Now, this is learned behavior, right? It's transmitted through either primary or secondary socialization, and it guides our manner of interactions. Now, these scripts are presumptions, they're biases, there are stereotypes, and they are triggered when we engage in interactions. And often when we talk about racial scripts, often the defensive response occurs, certainly if you're in the majority, the defensive response is often, but I'm not racist, right? But the scripts, as you will notice, they are racial scripts that we use that go both ways. They are reciprocal. They're not unidirectional. They're not unidirectional. Okay? So for the same way in which the majority may have particular images or socioeconomic, stereotypes about individuals who may be African American or Latino, they go the other direction as well. All right? You can just think about issues that happen in New York with Korean grocers, right? You can think about Latinos, right? You can think about them with in-group issues. Okay, so there's a whole landscape. But I'm going to focus certainly on the issue with respect to African Americans, because that's sort of the most, at least what's being highlighted as of late. Okay? Now, so we start with this notion of these scripts, right? And in effect, we deal with this, so we have these scripts, we walk through them, we use them, if you will, unconsciously or consciously. Some folks use them consciously, some folks who are racist. I mean, let's just be honest. There are people who are racist. I mean, it exists, right? But most of us are not, right? Most of us should receive the benefit of the doubt. We are acting unconsciously on how we were brought up, okay? And so that's part of who we are, but they are triggered unconsciously, right? They exist, all right? My wife teaches in the Women and Gender Studies department. I clearly understand the issues of gender, right? But often you get lost in the daily and you forget. And you may do something that may be discriminatory or biased or what have you, and it could be totally unintentional. Okay, so those are things that exist that exist initially. Now I say that to say this as follows: we should not presume that merely because you put on a blue uniform that you are somehow immune from having these racial scripts. And I say the same thing about judges. Just because you put on a black robe doesn't mean that magically you put on some Harry Potter robe and your racial scripts are gone. It doesn't exist that way. We all have to work affirmatively to disavow and not act upon these particular scripts themselves. Right? So that's lesson one. That's the first thing. The second thing, with respect to this continued salience, is the historical and contemporary narratives that are drawn from both individual and collective experiences. Right? So now, in this particular narrative, right, the most important things we see, regardless of how it becomes a part of your collective experience, right, it's reflective often of negative encounters. Right? If you think about the very positive encounters we have, we put them away. The things which stay with us the longest are those which may cause trauma, things that are sort of negatively based, that sort of impact us the longest and stay with us. And they get communicated from generation to generation, right? So consider the events that occurred certainly during the Civil Rights era, right? The interactions between African Americans that has been captured in books and grainy black and white television images shows individuals who are being denied their rights not simply through the actions of fellow citizens or being denied access by commercial owners, but being denied those rights from authorities, individuals who may have worn badges, individuals who may have been members of law enforcement. That's part of the historical narrative that we have with respect to this issue of citizen and law enforcement interaction, right? For example, individuals who wore a badge were complicit in the disappearance, of the 3 slain civil rights leaders, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, right? Moreover, who can forget the iconic images of Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right, with law enforcement standing there denying access, or dogs being used to prevent protesters from trying to register to vote or simply wanting to sit down at a lunch counter, right? This is part of our historical narrative about citizen and law enforcement interactions that we must come to terms with. It is seared in our nation's history and our memory, and that's a part of it, right? And as such, they have come to define this relationship before we even sort of engage in some of these events. And so one scholar has said, research has found that blacks express more dissatisfaction with police than whites do because they are frequently subjected to aggressive police patrols, excessive use of force, and racially biased policing. And these experiences, along with a history of degradation, have led to tenuous relations between many black citizens and the police, such that even in the absence of bias, police fairness is brought into question, which becomes the most important part, right? That in effect, law enforcement may be given the benefit of the doubt if there was no such longer track record. And in instances in which it might be justified, they are less likely to receive the benefit of the doubt from a population that has always seen themselves as victim in relationship to those who actually are engaged in law enforcement. All right, and so that sets the further sort of contextual, if you will, baseline. Now, if of course we take a look at these interactions, right, and we consider fundamentally these sort of admonitions and so forth, and if we look at the most contemporary events that have happened across the country, we begin to see, we identify race and gender. But let's be clear, it's not just African American men, right? What's often missing from the discussion is the gender component, African American women and other women of color who have been disabused, if you will, at the hands of law enforcement, right? Fannie Lou Hamer, savagely beaten by Mississippi police officers in '63. Right? But we often talk about the others. Now, this communication of this particular relationship is transferred from generation to generation. Okay? My parents grew up in a segregated South, in a Jim Crow South, and their words of caution to me are the words of caution that parents today give to African American youth in the wake of the most recent incidents. Right? The rules of how to survive an encounter with law enforcement. These are very real things that are told, right? Stop immediately. Make sure you pull over in a timely manner so that you're not suspected of running. Never ever run from the police, right? It gives them a reason to use violence. Never return violent police action with violence or you're going to be hurt. Put your hands up and say, I'm not resisting. Keep your hands visible at all times. Don't reach in your pocket, don't appear to be reaching for anything, and keep your hands on your steering wheel if you're stopped in a vehicle, right? Don't talk back, right? Be overly respectful. Follow the instructions of the officer. Be careful of the way you dress, because in some people's eyes, your clothing may make you a suspect. Right? Be careful walking in groups, because you can be considered a gang. Make sure you say your name, where you live, and where you work. It makes you more human. And always, always simply do the right thing. Right? This is the narrative that is communicated, that is transferred, and this becomes a part of the context. This is the backdrop in which many of these encounters have occurred. Okay? And if you can think about the other side of it, if you think about, in effect, how you must engage or dress or talk or walk or act in order to survive in a particular neighborhood or area, that may be fundamentally contrary to what you have just been told by your parents. Right? Disavowing, if you will, a suit and a tie for something that looks so you fit into your neighborhood. Very different. Right? But of course, even with a suit and a tie, the visible characteristic, certainly for me, is certainly race. And I tell my students this all the time. I go, all those wonderful degrees I have, right? The fact that I've been to all these schools. I tell my students, when I walk out of our law school building, I'm just a black person walking out on campus. They don't know I'm a professor. They don't have a PhD. They don't know if I have a law degree. They don't know where I live. And yet, I have never had a traffic ticket, never been stopped, questioned. And when I drive in my own vehicle, a Subaru, not a fancy car, very safe car, not a fancy car by any stretch of the imagination, that even when law enforcement are behind me, I check and double check and make sure that every single rule of the road that should be followed is followed. Put my signal light on, I check the speed limit, right? Make sure that everything is working. In fact, there was a period of time most recently when my car when my headlight was broken and I refused to drive my car at night because I had one headlight broken, right? These are the things you sort of consider and think about, right, when dealing with potential interactions, okay? So, from the historical to the contemporary. Personal experiences, both direct and vicarious, become the lens through which all encounters are viewed, and the anticipation of what the encounter will be, the perception of how the encounter will act, how the other person will act, and reinforcing those expectations becomes incredibly important. So one scholar has said, perceptions of police encounters are not simply a function of direct experiences, rather they are more complicated and appear to be tied to larger social processes, such as more long-standing trust in social institutions, which had one of the strongest independent effects on perceptions of disrespect by the police. For African Americans, these experiences are potentially tied to a history of conflict that has accumulated over time. In some respects, the interaction may not have been even with an individual who was a law enforcement person, but another institution of authority. But because law enforcement are often the front line, the first contact, this is where the initial, if you will, conflict, confrontation, escalation, or potential de-escalation occurs. Okay? You may have nothing to do with a law enforcement, but a friend, a cousin, someone you know had a terrible public defender because they were overburdened, underpaid. They had a terrible case. The outcome was terrible. And now that becomes part of the consciousness, right? The narrative, the collective experience, right? Now, of course, this contemporary experience is also framed by what Director James Comey said, right? Director of the FBI. At many points in American history, law enforcement enforced the status quo. A status quo that was often brutally unfair to disfavored groups. One reason we cannot forget our law enforcement legacy is that the people we serve and protect cannot forget it either. Much research points to the widespread existence of unconscious bias. Something happens to people in law enforcement, he says. Many of us develop different flavors of cynicism that we work hard to resist because they can be lazy mental shortcuts. Criminal suspects routinely lie about their guilt, and nearly everybody we charge is guilty. That makes it easy for some folks in law enforcement to assume that everybody is lying, and that no suspect, regardless of their race, could be innocent. Police officers on patrol in our nation's cities often work in environments where a hugely disproportionate percentage of street crime is committed by young men of color. Something happens to people of goodwill working in that environment, and after years of police work, officers then can't help but be influenced by the cynicism that they feel. A mental shortcut becomes almost irresistible and maybe even rational by some lights. The two young black men on one side of the street look like so many others the officer has locked up, and two white men on the other side of the street, even in the same clothes, do not. The officer does not make the same association about the two white guys, whether the officer is white or black, and that drives different behavior. The officer turns toward one side of the street and not the other. We need to come to grips with the fact that this behavior complicates the relationship between police and the communities they serve. He also went on to say in that same speech that we also need to recognize the complicity on the other side. Communities in which there is no access, there are structural barriers to access, have produced or at least engendered some nihilism among those who live in those communities, where in fact gang life becomes the routine, becomes the rule, not the exception, right? And that feeds in also into this conflict relationship, this negative interaction, if you will, that exists, okay? And that's not to be ignored either. And so we talk about this, the director says these things, and he's basically encapsulated what many have already sort of knew, right? Now, the assessments that certainly minorities have of police, right, regardless of whether police behavior meets legal standards of appropriateness, African Americans' perceptions of unfair, unjust, or otherwise unequal treatment from the police have serious consequences for these relationships. Their lived experiences and their subjectivities. This is especially necessary for young black males who are frequently studied as offenders and viewed as potential troublemakers. The legal definition for justification is one thing. The problem becomes when that legal definition is in conflict with one's understanding or one's moral definition or understanding of that particular issue. And that is often another point of conflict, right? But more importantly, the key is that that is often then influenced by what has already happened. You don't get the benefit of the doubt if, in fact, you have a track record of potentially stepping across the line. You're less likely to receive the benefit of the doubt. Now, I say these things and the idea about sort of law enforcement here and citizens in a vein of understanding what they do. Okay? Recognize what they do. Law enforcement are called upon to go into places most of us would not dare to go, and to do a job most of us would not sign up to do. Right? I'll be the first to admit it. I am not about to walk into a dark building looking for somebody. That's just not going to happen. Right? That's a particular personality. Firefighters, firefighters, they run into burning buildings. Most of us are running out of burning buildings. Right? So this is not to denigrate the profession itself, but to recognize and affect the landscape of the profession and the landscape of the interactions that exist, right? And how they may influence and affect certainly community dynamics. So what we have over time, because of these high-profile incidents, because of this sort of long track record, there's a legal cynicism that develops, right? So one of the most sort of consistent findings in research on attitudes toward police is that legal cynicism is much more prevalent among minorities and whites. And this is the case even for black police officers, right? So in the recent high-profile incidents, one of the saving graces has been hire more minority law enforcement officers. That's not the solution. Because it's not about who is in the uniform, but the culture of the institution that creates, if you will, the conflict, right? That's one of the defining things. Yes, you can change the nature of the uniform itself or who's in the uniform, but there's still this particular dynamic that exists. So there is some debate about the role of social class in shaping these particular attitudes. For instance, there are several studies that have found stronger negative perceptions of police injustice and disapproval of racial profiling among middle class and professional African Americans. Take, for example, Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Remember his case? This was the beer summit with Obama and the aftermath, but prior to the beer summit, he was trying to enter his home, to which his neighbor called and said, someone's breaking in. He's in his home. This interaction turned out to be pretty bad. It was a very negative one. Challenged in his own domain. Now, consider if we had just changed jurisdictions from Massachusetts to Florida, and this was a castle doctrine jurisdiction, right, where you get to shoot first and defend your home, or a stand your ground jurisdiction, what the danger may have been, right? Consider also those same elements when you talk about populations or communities in which most individuals are denied the opportunity to possess a firearm because of a past conviction, and their inability to actually exercise stand your ground or castle doctrine to protect their homes. I just had a student who did a report the other day about a single mother who was an ex-offender who said, I'm a single mom living in a particular area. I can't afford to live someplace else. It's not as safe as I would like it to be, but because of my felony conviction, I can't own a firearm. It's an interesting sort of concept when you think about individuals, where they must end up, where they sort of live, right? All right, so with that said, or think about New York Times columnist Charles Blow and his son. Or to call him, Yale University student, right, Connecticut, a suspect looked like him. Campus police drew a weapon, told him to get down on the ground. And because he followed the 10 rules, he walked away alive, right? Or consider the UVA student. Remember him? Out at the bar, said he used a fake ID, ATF, ends up getting a bloodied face. In each of these spaces, these are spaces of privilege. One's home, college campuses, and yet the citizen law enforcement interaction, mediated certainly by issues of race, potentially, about this backdrop, about belonging and sense of belonging and who belongs where, plays itself out. Okay? And the reason why often middle class and or professional persons of color feel even more aggrieved is because often they are in settings in which the interaction is not negative. But once they leave often their comfort zone, in this case they didn't even leave their comfort zones, then in effect they get treated as if the status which accompanies them was no longer present. Okay? So, excuse me. We have our legal cynicism. Juveniles, of course, have less favorable attitudes toward the police than adults. Much of this is also because of our wonderful new zero tolerance policies in high schools, right? Particularly think about where zero tolerance applies, to whom it gets applied to, the jurisdictions. And so Lieber and his colleagues sort of talk about that minority youths, if you will, consistently expressed more negative views of the police than did whites, and race and ethnicity was the strongest predictor of perceptions of police fairness and police discrimination. Negative and involuntary police contacts result in less favorable attitudes toward the police, and much of the recent research in this area has specifically examined the issue of racial profiling. Net of other factors, race and personal experience with racial profiling are among the strongest and most consistent predictors of attitudes toward the police, right? You can add racial profiling to that. You can add stop and frisk, right? The policies in which individuals jump out, stop and frisk. If you ever read the report on the stop and frisk case in New York City, where it was occurring in predominantly African American and Latino neighborhoods in Harlem. And the policy one is one that's very clear. Law enforcement would roll up, they would see individuals, they'd stop out. What do you got on you? Pat them down. Right? That was a daily occurrence for many of these young men because of where they were and because of who they were. Right? They didn't drive up to the Columbia University campus in New York City and pop out and pat down the engineering student. Right? But the proximity of Harlem and Columbia is such in New York that it's very close by. I would imagine on many college campuses, right? You've got the neighborhood that's just abutting it, that's right outside. You know, universities bought up the land around, that was very cheap, right? You've got all those wonderful sort of issues that sort of exist, the conflict, the tensions. All right. So what they found is, so Jones-Brown survey, certainly of some black high school males, found the following in a suburban and primarily non-delinquent sample. She found that 91% of young men had been stopped by the police and more than half reported 5 or more contacts. Moreover, approximately half of the sample rated these contacts unfavorably, describing the police as disrespectful and physically intrusive and attributing the stops to racial bias, self-reporting. Right? So high rates of being targeted by the police combined with perceptions of unfair and disrespectful treatment likely have a cumulative effect on urban minority young men's perceptions of the police. Fagan's examination of racial discrimination specifically highlights the importance of understanding the impact of accumulated discriminatory experiences. If, in effect, you go to an institution or a high school in which you can be dismissed, you can be suspended, you can be put in trouble for merely talking back, right? Your first contacts with the juvenile justice system, then followed up by walking in your neighborhood and being stopped and frisked and or harassed, then clearly the track record, the lived experience of this interaction becomes mediated in your life. That becomes your daily lived experience. Okay? It becomes conditioned. I grew up in a New York in which every time you walked into a store, there was a security guard there who made you leave your bag at the door. Right? A conditioned response. Curious enough, every time you walk into a store, I would always look to the right or left. Is there someone here to take my bag? If I'm carrying a knapsack, a bag of some sort. Right? When I go shopping, I make sure I've had on a particular kind of clothing. All right? You don't move things towards you. This becomes the conditioned response in those settings. Transform those into settings and interactions with law enforcement. Okay? And that becomes, it's even more powerful when you think about these are individuals to whom we want folks to turn to for assistance when they need help. And if you fear the person to whom you turn to, whom you are expected to turn to for help, then what does that mean? All right? Folks talk about community response times, calling law enforcement, not calling them, abdicating control. My mentor, Eli Anderson, talks about in his books about Streetwise, that there's been an abdication of control, if you will, of police authority and social control in neighborhoods, and folks have tried to wrest this control back. And yet there's a conflict that exists in those communities. Folks don't want criminal activity in the communities, but they also do not want to place someone in the system. Right? So you may be less likely to report criminal activity. Why? Because you recognize the impact and the import of what that means. Okay? For example, if you have a felony conviction, depending upon the jurisdiction you are in, you will lose the right to vote for a period of time, except in Maine and Vermont, either while you're incarcerated or while you're incarcerated and then when you're on probation, or after you have finished probation for a period of time until you have had your rights restored. And that's just one. You can't serve on a jury. You may lose parental custody, parental rights. It also may impact, if you will, employment opportunities. If it's a drug crime, for housing issues. If it's you're a sex offender, for residency issues as well as employment. And the list goes on and on and on. And if you happen to be a non-citizen at the time, then you can be deported. Or in some of the most egregious cases, there's a case called Padilla versus Kentucky. An individual who had spent 40 years in our country, was a legal permanent resident, was a Vietnam veteran, was caught trafficking a tractor trailer full of marijuana, clearly not possession, right? Not for personal use, right? This was about distribution, and he was in effect eligible to be deported. The court changes the case or overturns the case on an issue of ineffective assistance of counsel, not on the morality of sort of this individual staying. But these are sort of the implications of, if you will, living in a particular area or neighborhood and criminal activity going on, because individuals know of what's at stake. It's not as easy to say, oh, turn in people who are doing wrong, when in fact doing so may put that kind of burden upon their particular lives, right? Now, I talk about this, and these effects are clearly pronounced for African Americans, but it's not solely restricted to African Americans or in urban environments, right? Consider the story of Sureshbhai Patel. If I remember him, if you don't, here he is. The 57-year-old grandfather that was left temporarily paralyzed after being roughed up by a Madison County, Alabama police officer, apparently for looking suspicious. He had just moved from his small town of PG, India, to the suburbs of Madison. He had moved there to help take care of his 17-month-old grandson, so his son, Chirag Patel, who was an engineer, could pursue his master's degree in electrical engineering at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. According to a news report, Sureshbhai was on his routine morning walk when an anonymous caller reported that a suspicious man was looking into garages. The officers located him. They tried asking him to stop walking, but because this was his second time in the United States and he spoke very little English, he told the officer no English, Indian, and he gave them his son's house number while pointing to the house. It was at this point the officers attempted to search him, which led to his injury. They said he was moving for something in his pocket. There's a conflict here. But that's suburban part of Alabama, Madison County. Someone who was not African American, not race, but ethnicity, right? Language issues. And so you think about this sort of in the context of what does this mean? That now becomes a part of the narrative, right? The impact, if you will. So, in what many would define as spaces where there is an expectation that citizen law enforcement interactions will not be negative, these examples indicate that there are no privileged spaces for people of color, in effect, which gets us to this notion of the social ecology of policing, place. So first, the more aggressively or disrespectfully the police have behaved at the onset of the encounter, the more likely suspects are to resist or be noncompliant. Negative police actions, such as disrespect, are both ecologically patterned and disproportionately experienced by African Americans. And finally, when police behavior is taken into account, males and minority citizens are more likely to show compliance, and the highest rates of compliance are found in white officer minority citizen encounters, right? You heard the rules, the 10 rules, how to survive, and yet we still have some of these difficult outcomes. These findings suggest that the relationship between race and the suspect demeanor is very much complicated by the way police interact with these particular communities. So, the social ecology of policing. Research in the United States documents a wide range of harms. Disproportionate experience with surveillance and stops, disrespectful treatment and verbal abuse, arrests, the use of force, including excessive and deadly force, right? Police deviance, as well as fewer police protections and slower response times. And specifically, minorities that are young and male who bear the largest share of these negative experiences, right? And so we've got this ecological determination of where this kind of policing may occur. But there's another side now, right, in which we've often talked about, or folks have talked about, this community policing and hotspot policing, right? The community policing, this old adage, you have the cop walking the beat, the idea that they know everyone, and we move to statistics-driven, metric-driven policing, right? Hotspot policing. You find out where the problems are, you send in officers, resources, and you arrest people, and you engage in making it sort of safe, right? Social control. People want that, right? Quite simply, people who live in areas and that are crime-ridden say, listen, we want officers here. We want a law enforcement presence. They want a law enforcement presence to remove those who are engaging in criminal activity, but not the disrespect of those who may not. And there's often a lack of distinguishing between the two, a lack of distinction, right? And so what you have is that you have police behavior, right, in this era of sort of proactive, aggressive crime control strategies, excuse me, while arguably not causing the grave harms that results from brutality, right, and deadly force, getting hassled by the police may in fact have more widespread cumulative effects both on the individuals and on the collective consciousness of these particular communities, okay? Moreover, when you move in that direction and you talk about ecological policing, social ecology of policing, you get into individuals or ancients or areas in which researchers sort of look at or try to disentangle race from the impact of a disadvantaged community. And what you get is you get the identification of places and spaces as dangerous places, suspicious places, so that everyone who is there is now suspect for something dirty, right? For doing something criminal. Even if you are going there for above-board purposes, you are now in the dangerous place, the suspicious place, and thus the presumption that goes along with that, right? Consider the white college student who drives into an area that is known for crack dealing. That student, that individual, is now perceived to be someone who is engaged in drug activity, right? That's about the place itself, how we begin to label places in this regard. Okay? And what you see is you see the following things, right? So Hemmons and Levin sort of summarize as follows. These more aggressive procedures increase hostility toward the police in inner city neighborhoods and among those minority groups who are the primary targets of these proactive policing tactics. And such tactics involve the extensive use of police discretion and provide multiple opportunities for the abuse of authority. One result of these aggressive police tactics is the stopping and questioning of many innocent persons. You are permitted to walk away, right? Police officer stops and says, "Can I see your ID?" You don't have to, right? But that changes depending on who you are, either race, ethnicity, class, and or gender and age, right? Who's more likely to walk away? Oh, I'm not going to show you anything. At that point, I've just disrespected this law enforcement officer. And I don't know if you saw the article in the Washington Post, the officer who said the following. This is a great quote. "If you merely comply with my authority, then you won't be tased, handcuffed, arrested, or possibly shot. Simply comply, and we're good to go." Right? Now, consider that. I'm a New Yorker. I don't comply. We just don't comply. We're New Yorkers, right? Now, you add in the mix, you guys on campus, you add a little testosterone in the mix. Really? Did you just challenge me and my own authority? Have you treated me with respect? You've got a situation that is ripe for disaster. You have a powder keg waiting to explode, right? And now you add all the precursors that I talked about, the racial scripts, the historical narratives, right? Director Comey's point of view about who is more likely to have been arrested, and you add more fuel to this particular fire, which means now communities are not seen as places in which individuals exist that we must protect and serve, but now, and as Dr. Spencer, I guess, had early speakers, these are militarized zones to which, in effect, we are engaging war against citizens because we have to protect them in this manner. We have changed how policing occurs, right? We have increased the militarization. There was one crazy report about a district in, I think it was in Washington or whatever, that had like a bazooka. Who are you going after? What are you going after? Right? Ferguson, Missouri. They put up the armored tanks on the street with snipers on top. Right? This is not addressing the response. When I saw the images from Ferguson, I had a moment of pause as I watched it on television with my 7-year-old son, who's African American. He's biracial. And we watched it, and he said, it was very curious. We see the images and so forth. And the following day, I went to work, and I thought about the citizen law enforcement interactions and the continued salience of race in place. And I thought about Mr. Bundy on his ranch, on federal grounds, right? Federal law enforcement pitched a camp, right? Weapons were trained, no one shot anybody. Trained against federal officers, right? Folks flocked there to defend against the oppressive federal government from removing him from his land. And I thought to myself, if the protesters in Ferguson had walked through the streets of Ferguson, exercising their Second Amendment right in the same manner, it would have been a bloodbath, right? Just consider the young man in Beaver Creek, Ohio, in the Walmart. An open carry jurisdiction. You are allowed to possess weapons openly in public. Picked up the gun, right, the air rifle that was sold by Walmart. Okay? Called and said, oh, he's threatening. The moments that they arrived, shortly thereafter, and he was shot and killed. Race in place? So, which of course takes us to the contemporary examples, right? Tulsa, Oklahoma, the mistaken shooting of the unarmed man by the by the reserve deputy, Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio, the young kid who was shot in the park, okay? Eric Garner in Queens, New York, John Crawford, which is the Beaver Creek, Ohio case, Michael Brown, Ferguson, Missouri, and of course, Walter Scott. So these deaths at the hands of law enforcement have focused statewide, national, and even international attention, right, on these particular issues. Ferguson, he's shot and killed. Michael Brown is shot and killed following an incident where he's apparently told to move out of the street and after he had committed an alleged strong-arm robbery, right? The town, Ferguson, is 67.4% African American, 29.3% white, 0.5% Asian, 0.4% Native American, 0.4% from other races, 2% from Hispanic. The police, 94% white, 50 officers who are white, and 3 who are African American. More importantly, St. Louis, the problem in St. Louis County is it's a county that has 90 municipalities. Now, Missouri is a problem already. Missouri has 114 counties. I don't know what they were thinking when they created that governmental structure, but God knows what. But the county of St. Louis has 90 municipalities, and each one of them, or a couple of them, most of them I think, have their own police force. So you can drive a 2-mile stretch through Ferguson and hit at least 5, 6, 7 law enforcement agencies, right? So that broken taillight that you got stopped for in this jurisdiction, you might get stopped for 6 more times by 6 different law enforcement agents, all right, from different jurisdictions, right? Thinking about sort of the structure and layout of cities and so forth. And here, of course, in North Charleston, what you have, 37% non-Hispanic white, 46% African American, 0.34% Native American, 1.92% Asian, and 0.12% Pacific Islander. Of course, the police force here, 300 sworn officers, 80% of whom are white, right? And like I said, it's often not about the race of the individuals who are in the uniform, but in effect what the uniform represents. I'll leave you with sort of the last 2 things and I'll finish up and we can sort of engage in a discussion. So the DOJ came down with its report, right, in the aftermath of Ferguson. And they talked about sort of 2 examples which I think sort of highlight the significance or the salience of both race and place itself. So the first was this individual who was sitting outside a basketball court. Even relatively routine misconduct by Ferguson police officers can have significant consequences for the people whose rights are violated. For example, in the summer of 2012, a 32-year-old African-American man sat in his car cooling off after playing basketball in a Ferguson public park. An officer pulled up behind the man's car, blocking him in, and demanded the man's social security card, his number and identification. Without any cause, the officer accused the man of being a pedophile, referring to the presence of children in the park, and ordered him out of the car for a pat-down. Now, the officer had no reason to believe that the man was armed. The officer also asked to search his car. He objected, citing his constitutional rights. In response, the officer arrested the man, reportedly at gunpoint, charging him with 8 violations of Ferguson's municipal code. One charge, making a false declaration, was for initially providing the short form of his first name. He said Mike instead of Michael. And giving an address which, although legitimate, was different from the one on his driver's license. Another charge was for not wearing a seatbelt, even though he was seated in a parked car. The officer also charged the man both with having an expired operator's license, having no operator's license in his possession, and the man informed the DOJ that because of these charges, he lost his job as a contractor with the federal government that he'd held for years. Second one, the one with the parking ticket. They spoke with an African-American woman who has a still pending case from 2007 when on a single occasion she parked her car illegally, received 2 citations and a $151 fine plus fees. She experienced financial difficulties and periods of homelessness over several years. She was charged with 7 failure to appear offenses for missing court dates or fine payments on her tickets between 2007 and 2010. And for each failure to appear, the court issued an arrest warrant and imposed new fines and fees. And from 2007 to 2014, she was arrested twice and she spent 6 days in jail. She paid $550 to the court for the events stemming from this single instance of illegal parking. And they showed that she wanted to make partial payments, and the court returned them. They accepted one partial payment because they couldn't send the letter back. She's now making regular payments, and as of December 2014, over 7 years later, despite initially owing $151 and having already paid $550, she still owed $541. Citizen law enforcement interactions are complex, right? And yet there's clearly something that is amiss When entire communities feel under siege or targeted because of negative interactions with law enforcement, that is something that needs to be fixed and needs to be fixed fast. Today, the imagery of the use of force, excessive, and that which may be justified, is compelling and is quickly disseminated, often reaffirming, right, long-held perceptions and perspectives of the others. Undoing these long-standing narratives and overcoming racial scripts is more than just about retraining, although that would help, right, moving away from militarization. It's about redefining how we see communities and the citizens who reside in them. It's about having a different perspective on those communities and the residents within them. And it's about breaking down some of those barriers and spaces and places. Who belongs where, who belongs in this particular setting, in that particular setting, who shouldn't be in this setting, and in effect, what these settings should actually look like. So, thank you. And I'm happy to take questions. Sure, sure. Bless you.
It seems that most of us are planners.
Yep.
So you ended on the right note in the sense of what needs to be done, right?
Yep.
So what I hear from you is that training will fix the social ecology of policing in the U.S. But at the same time, I doubt that's the case. Please say something more.
Sure. Training is a start, right? I think maybe just after Michael Brown was shot and killed, there was an NPR report, I think from a Seattle officer who was in charge, female officer who was in charge of the training. And she said that it had become such a militarized structure, right? Very much reflecting our military in how we were sort of engaging in training, and that needed to change. And so that was one of the fundamental things that needed to change, was how we basically were teaching officers to be officers, right? And rather than sort of seeing combatants, seeing citizens and seeing folks who actually needed assistance. So training is certainly part of it. The second piece, also from that NPR story, was the creating of the special divisions to deal with certain issues. There was the mental health issue, right? Retraining on how we address mental health issues. I think Dr. Spencer mentioned that there was someone in Greenville who was shot, who was suffering from a mental illness, and who was shot because folks didn't recognize it, right? Last night while I was going over my talk, I was watching Alaska State Troopers. You know, those one of those great National Geographic things. And there was someone who was lying down in the street in the parking lot outside this bar. Now they could have done a couple of things, right? They could have arrested the man, put him in the squad car, and taken him off to jail. But rather they said, let's explore and see what's going on. And it turns out that he was suffering from insulin shock. He was a diabetic, right? So rather than sort of recognizing or seeing that as a social control problem, they sort of saw it as what is wrong and how do we address the problem, not being him, but the circumstances. That's the sort of the second thing. The third thing, there was also this notion of having law enforcement walk through neighborhoods and address issues, because there are folks in certain communities, given the community issues that already exist, who aren't going to go report stuff. And so it means having a more personal face, right? Having someone who is a community liaison who does more than just sit at the precinct and create community programming, but actually liaises with the public, walks the beat, gets to know people, right? Says, oh, look, are you having any problems? Are you having any issues? Oh, you know what? Someone keeps breaking my window, or blah, 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 or there's this graffiti. Oh, well, let's see if we can work this out. Let's see if we can figure out a solution, right? That becomes, those I think are sort of steps. The other steps are the ones that, you know, I'm sort of pie in the sky, progressive that I am. We need to sort of redefine, in effect. You know, I'm a big, I take I took one of my urban sociology classes, and you know, we constantly talk about sort of concentrations of poverty, right? I don't know if you all sort of, you know, they got rid of the Cabrini Green houses in Chicago, right? Because public housing used to be mixed income, so you didn't have concentrations of poverty, so schools actually had a better tax base, right? And you had different income levels, and they got rid of that, and so then it became concentrations. And part of it is to recognize that we can't do that, right? And particularly we can't do that when we put on the ballot tax measures and folks say, no, I'm not doing that. Or we allow for white flight from St. Louis County, or black flight, middle class flight, because we don't want to pay city taxes, we want our own, and we don't want to contribute to the larger greater good, right? The 90 municipalities were set up not because individuals didn't like St. Louis, they didn't want to put into the St. Louis pot, They didn't want the tax base from St. Louis. They wanted their own self-determination, their own sovereignty, and they were also running from in-migration of people of color and ethnic groups, right? That's how you get our wonderful little exurbs, right? People keep moving in, immigrants move in, take over, and they move out. Another set of immigrants move in, right? You get this sort of, you know, our wonderful sort of city of courses, right? The idea, you got our concentric circles, right? You know, urban planners, you guys all got that, right? You move in and whoop, oh, who's coming now? Oh, we gotta go. Next group comes, oh, we gotta go. And next comes in, right? And then you get the group that can't go anywhere. They're stuck, and there you have it, right? And you're like, okay.
I want to go back to your scripts.
Sure.
Because how do we re-script? I think that's really, you know, all of us.
Yeah. Oh, we do.
As you know, aptly pointed out.
Oh, we do.
The script goes both ways.
It does.
It goes both ways. So how do we re-script? Because I think that's,
Yeah.
that plus the environment in which police operate, that
Yeah.
combination is what creates
Sure.
this problem.
The first thing is that we cannot be scared of the conversations, right? People sort of, you know, are always talking sort of down about political correctness, and I think language is appropriate, but I think you can't sort of get ballistic when language might be offensive, potentially, right? And you have to recognize where people come from. I stand up in a room and teach students, some of mine who are from the state of Missouri, who didn't go to school with a single black person, right? Didn't live in their town, they didn't know anybody, they get to college, and where Columbia, Missouri, a town of 80,000 is a big city to them, right? I grew up in New York City. I'm like, really? This is like my apartment building, right? They're like, oh no, I lived in a town of 3,000 or 500, and part of it is a lack of exposure. So part of it is we can't sort of be uncomfortable with those difficult discussions. We do have to move beyond being cowards and being a little more brave and recognizing that it is going to be painful, right? Those are not easy discussions. The second thing is recognizing that we have privilege. But recognizing that you have privilege doesn't mean you need to be embarrassed about being privileged, or that your privilege hasn't given you an advantage. I went to a private school for 12 years. I went to Brown University. I went to the University of Pennsylvania. I am privileged, right? Even though my parents were sharecroppers. My children are privileged because of where I am. They are the beneficiaries of the sacrifices my parents made and the privilege that I have, right? I'm the first to say that I'm a buppy, right? I'm a black yuppie. I'm a buppy, right? That's who I am. That's what I am, right? I know no shame in that. The thing becomes then how do you use that? How do you exercise that, right? Do you use it because you're entitled and you say everything should come my way? Or do you use it and say, okay, what do I need to do, right? Or what am I entitled to? And you might not be entitled to do or have to do anything. But recognizing it doesn't mean in effect that it somehow makes you a bad person. We went on a civil rights tour trip over spring break, and we went to several different stops, and I think we were at the National Civil Rights Museum, and there was an interesting sort of a display that said that slavery constituted 12 generations, right? Well, consider that, 12 generations of lack of wealth, access, and accumulation, right? And we're just really talking about several generations removed to dealing with recovery, right? I mean, that's a very real thing, and I'm a beneficiary of one of those beneficiaries of that. So one is having the difficult conversations, the other is making sure that we sort of recognize that we do have advantages. The third is recognizing where are the areas of privilege, right? So I used to teach at the same high school for about 4 years, and I went to a conference, and they did a very interesting exercise. They said, if you are male, you're on this side of the room, and then you go this side of the room, right? If you are African American, this side of the room, and this side, or a person of color, this side of this room. If you are heterosexual, this side of the room. If you're gay, this side of the room, right? And so forth. And you begin to recognize dimensions of privilege that you may not see that you have, right? So me, the lens through which I view my identity is, oh, I'm an African American, this is the context, whatever, but not recognizing that I have privilege as a man, right? I can walk at night, if I'm sort of not afraid of other issues, but I can walk at night and potentially not fear sexual assault that someone else who's a woman might feel, right? I have the privilege of at least currently being, when I'm married, my spouse and I, we have the benefits of the federal government, taxes and all those things, right, and some of my friends don't, right? And so there is those multiple intersectionalities which we also need to recognize. And the last thing I'll say, and also other questions, I had a student in my torts class. So after Ferguson happened, after the indictment came down, we had to sort of talk about it. And so I said, who wants to sort of stand up and talk about it? And this young man got up, this white male got up, and he said, look, I was a former police officer, and I got my girlfriend pregnant when I was 16. I joined the military. I basically dropped out of high school, or not dropped out of high school, finished high school, came back, joined the police force, and I got paid minimum wage. Right? And he said, and our diversity training at that point in time was a sergeant sitting at the front of the room telling ethnic and racist jokes. Right? And he said, that's not who you want. He said, you want to talk about, you have to give the respect to those individuals who join the force. They do a job that deserves respect too. And recognizing that they do a dangerous job that deserves respect, not minimum wage, more than that, right? And so it's and also recognizing that their horizons may not have been broadened. They may be the person who comes from the 300-person town, right? And may never have had interactions with others, right? So a number of those things.
I sort of wanted to build on that concept of place because obviously
Yes.
but also I come from a JV perspective, and my father grew up in Southside Chicago. He had a complete distrust of police, and ingrained that in me
Right.
because they were, he ran from the police because they were so corrupt. And one of our family members is a retired now ADA in Chicago, and he had been on the defense side for a period of time as well before he went into the DA's office. And when the Gates situation occurred, my father called him and said, okay, we need to talk about racial profiling, right? I need to understand more about this. And he differentiated this concept of which one of these things is not like the other versus racial profiling. And I want to know a little bit more about how place plays into that and how we as planners might be able to begin to ameliorate that. Because which one of these things is not like the other? It's respecting that those police officers were somewhat familiar with, components of their community and recognized that something was somewhat different or amiss, right? Regardless of the race of the officers. It's recognizing that something within a couple of blocks is a particular, you would expect a block to have particular behavior and particular uses. And, so when something is different, what do you do? Because they're trained to pay attention to those very slight differences, right?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly are trained to pay attention to differences. I think, okay, so racial profiling, though, to me, doesn't address the paying attention to difference.
Right.
It becomes a diminishing of that. It becomes a classification, and it becomes a categorization that we see, here's the profile, right? And the profile, and if you've ever seen the drug interdiction profile that it used on the East Coast for the I-95 corridor, it wasn't a profile. It was a list of different factors, and there's a lot of things that were listed, right? So it was, they have a very nice car, they got a late model car, if it's this, and once you went through it, there was no difference. It was just everybody who looks like this, and everybody who's driving a car, who basically just pick out who we want to, right? And that was the interdiction, and so they sort of did that. When sort of law enforcement, I think, are engaging in communities or creating communities and sort of looking at what's sort of out of place, the problem becomes one of, we all have to engage in this sort of, to get rid of this cognitive dissonance, right? We can't sort of say, everybody I see is an individual, and therefore I'm going to treat everybody and process all the information. And so now it becomes, all righty. And part of that may be the precursor of getting to know who's in the community and who's not, right? That you actually know then that which is out of place, right? How do parents on the playground know when someone may be a potential child molester on the playground? It's a face they haven't seen there before, right? How do you know someone's out of place? Because you are familiar with the people and the people who are in the place. And I think that's the difference in the distinction. It's difficult, I think, to apply, right? Because it requires more than just, it requires a lot of time and effort to be there. That's the first thing. The second thing is that sometimes people may be out of place, but it's not the manner that you are addressing them if they're out of place, but the manner in which you address them, right? So you can challenge someone for being in a place, but it's the manner in which you're challenging them and how often you're challenging them. And I think that becomes the difference, right? That if I see someone in a particular neighborhood, and I also think the issue is, I don't first assume that they're out of place, right? The reason why you get the case Terry v. Ohio, right, which is the case of the individual who is basically casing the store, and the court says you can, with reasonable suspicion based upon law enforcement experience, you can say, this person looks like they're up to no good, right? And you can go in and you could ask them interesting, you start asking some questions. You get to figure out why they're there, right? Which is very different than, give me your ID, why are you here, as opposed to, oh, hey, how are you doing, what's going on, blah, 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 right? Which is a very different approach, right? And then you get to actually discern difference in a manner in which you are not initially escalating or showing disrespect. And I think that is actually at the foundation, right? And then you can start picking out the difference without a difference, and then it's no longer profiling, it is, in fact, actually engaging. So
it's not asserting authority.
Well, it's still asserting authority, right? I mean, consider. Didn't you guys kick somebody off the floor, some engineering students? Right? You were asserting authority, right? Right? You're still asserting authority, right? I mean, it's not like you're not, even if you go on your plug, like, listen, you don't really belong in this space, you need to go, right? It's a different than saying, you get the hell out of here, you don't belong here, right? Those are two different ways, and I would imagine the response would be fundamentally different. Now, I hear the response wasn't different here. I hear the response, right? I mean, I hear the response wasn't different here. You were polite, and they were like, oh, we ain't leaving. Right, but then of course, that's when you say the escalation that then might be appropriate, right? It's that initial contact that is, look, I think you need to, what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And then recognizing also that there's an authority figure there who actually has to engage in the de-escalation to at some point, right? Is this really worthwhile to make this an issue? And you get this, right? Now, and there's also issues about, look, you're citizens. We have to comply, right? I mean, look, we get stopped. We want people to drive safely. We want things to happen. So part of it is you give up certain rights, but it doesn't mean that you give them up always and only you, and you're the only person who does so, or the only group that does so. Sure.
Yeah, I guess I have a follow-up on that related to to what extent the distrust factor might become cyclical.
Mm-hmm.
So I know, I can only speak for myself, but I got many of the same rules handed down about police, absent traveling in groups and clubs. Those are the two that I didn't get. But so the other ones, it was like you just do it, you know what I mean? Like, do they say if you got to file a lawsuit later, that's what we'll do? Do you know what I mean? So so I wonder, so my interaction is, so I'm white, but so my interaction is like, want my ID? Do you know what I mean? I'm very compliant. And I check my mirrors too, and so I wonder if you're in a group or from a group that has a script that says you're going to get harassed by the police, to what extent then you become, when they address you, you become heightened too.
Oh,
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, without a doubt.
It sort of builds into a system that now we have a cyclical distrust, non-compliance, distrust, you know what I'm saying?
Right, well, consider this, right? If you are young, you're getting that script anyway. Right? If you were a teenager and you just started driving or you were going to college, your parents are saying, listen, this is what you do, right? The thing is that you might age out of that script, right? Or it may change fundamentally depending upon where you are, or the reaction might be different too, right? So law enforcement, and this is the lack of knowledge about communities and where law enforcement, I think, where we have fallen off, right? In the past, if someone does something wrong, it's, look, I know your parents. You need to cut this out. I'm calling so-and-so on the phone. As opposed to, I'm taking you out to the station now and I'm booking you. Right? That's a different response now because of the nature of law enforcement not being required to live where they often police, right? The residency requirements going away, right? Things like that. I mean, consider the person on the beat often lives there, right? As we have sort of transition. But using a little Durkheimian theory of anomie, fine. Not everyone's going to live there, not everyone's going to know who you are, right? Okay. So yeah, you get that script, right? But the question becomes, what comes across as more of a threat? A male or a woman? And is my script looking at you as a potential threat or not, right? How am I perceiving it? And this is the problem with racial profiling, is that you might be doing dirty, you might be the one trafficking in drugs, and I might be clean, but the profile says I'm the one and you're not, right? And so you get those issues. And so, yeah, I mean, parents give those admonitions all the time. They sort of say those things. You might age out of it. You might age out of it, right? Because, you get to a certain age, you go, oh, it's a middle-class white woman. Clearly she's not, whatever. Me, I may never age out of it. I mean, I can't really age out of it because I can't sort of race out of it, right? I can't gender out of it, right? And so I think there's some of that which goes on. Sure.
You brought up the case that happened in Madison, Alabama. I'm actually from there.
Oh.
I live a couple of neighborhoods down from where that actually happened.
Yeah.
And when I found out about that, I was personally shocked because Madison is literally the bedroom suburb community of Huntsville. It's all single family residences. Nothing bad happens. In fact, the police force, if they pull you over, half the time they don't give you a ticket and they just say, please be careful next time, please have a good day kind of a thing.
Right.
So what do you do in that case when you have
situation, like the backlash from the community, because there's not really distrust of the police system in Madison. So now that this has happened, how do you deal with this sort of situation?
Well, that's just it, right? So part of it becomes, how do you hold those accountable? And if you hold those accountable.
Well, I mean, he was immediately fired.
And that's the key, right? So the question becomes, the person is immediately held accountable. Then, of course, the right language is used, right? Oh, we're going to start engaging in some retraining, and we're going to do some things. I mean, there are going to be some unfortunate accidents, right? I mean, I think to disavow that there's never going to be an incident that occurs, right? But the question becomes, under what circumstances is it occurring? Is it occurring because I see the brown face and I got a call here and I don't know how to deal with someone who can't speak the language? Or is it because this person is honestly and truly a threat and I'm doing something, right? And that's bearing that out. Part of it is, certainly I think not just in that community, but in others, is for law enforcement to get over the fear of civilian review, right? I think there's a huge fear about having citizens look at circumstances and second guessing, right? But it doesn't mean you can't create a civilian review board that actually has police participants, either retired or whatever, to give a different perspective, right? Because in effect, I think that would therefore give greater trust to the community. I mean, in that one, I mean, I saw that case and I read that case and I was like, wow, what would you do differently? Now, part of it would be, did they have to, so what's he reaching for? Could they have subdued him without causing that kind of bodily harm, right? And that's gonna ask the question, what are the other non-lethal and non-severe injury means to do so? There may have been nothing, which is kind of unfortunate to get to, right? How do you sort of address that? That's a tough one, right? But I think that the first key is you get rid of the problem pieces, and I think they did that. So, but did folks sort of say, we got to change the structure of government, we got to move some people?
I know they did some like retraining and everything, and my parents are friends with the mayor, and they were talking to him, and they were going through and like looking at all the different instances and just making sure like that would never happen, because I mean that never happens in Alabama.
I mean, and part of it is maybe having conversations. I mean, is also recognizing the changing reflections and demographics of your community, right? So you got to realize who's coming in, right? You got to know who's going to be present, right? If you know that you've got a strong influx of Indian immigrants and families, you got to recognize that there may be some issues here. So we got to figure out what are the cultural signs and symbols that we need to read, because in effect, consider if you're trained in a particular law enforcement jurisdiction in which there's not a great deal of diversity, or the diversity is on the black-white binary, right? But doesn't address Latinos, doesn't address, I mean, you talk about communities like in Minnesota with the Hmong population, right? Or you talk about Indian populations, or you talk about Thai, or you're talking about very different cultural tools, cultural sort of, cultural competency. And so part of that, I mean, needs to recognize the shifting demographics of your community, so that you can address those individuals in a different way, right? It might just be saying like, oh, look, guess what? You know what? There's a new church that just was here, or a new mosque, or whatever. Oh, I guess there's some new people in town. As the chief, or look, we need to go and make ourselves known and figure out what's going on and have that conversation, so you are prepared for that, as opposed to treating it the same way, right? As, oh, well, this guy's just ignoring us. He's not really paying attention. What's really going on, right? That kind of thing. And it might just be.
In that area has become higher in recent years, because Huntsville is known for the engineering and technology, and it's drawing people from all over.
Yep, I went there too this spring break.
Yeah.
Pretty cool place. Yeah, no, I mean, you're right though, right? And you got incredibly diverse population, but it means, how do you deal with that diversity? And the thing is that you may have a shifting diversity that may be going so fast that you can't do add these people to the police force. But you can do, what's the community outreach? So we get to know the people who we're policing, right?
We talked about training as a possible way to fix some of these problems, but my question has to do with the recruiting or the intake side of police and policing as a profession.
Mm-hmm.
Who are the police? Where do they come from?
Yeah.
I mean, many people see this, it's kind of a working class job, and but you hear about some police forces where maybe they want a college degree, or maybe they want a criminal justice degree, or maybe they're on without having to just retrain people who may, through their entire upbringing, absorbed a lot of not very constructive ideas about how to interact with people from different backgrounds.
Mm.
Does the education and social class of police make a big difference? Is there anything to be done on that angle to make sure the police forces on the intake side have the sorts of people that are less likely
Sure.
to create problems? And can you filter out some of the problematic police officers? And I have no idea what the percentages are, like of any particular police force. And I think, I don't know, I'm stereotyping here, but there's going to be some problem people in there that are looking for trouble.
Well, I mean, okay, okay. So there are a couple of things, right? So this young man who got out of my class is actually now in law school, right? Went to college, different perspective, right? And so I would say, anecdotally, yes, right? That greater education, different socioeconomic status, that's going to change perspectives, right? Now, it might, but then of course consider, now, the last part was about sort of law enforcement officers, weeding them out, right? People.
Maybe
Yeah.
the ones that are most likely to have
Yeah.
really damaging interactions.
Well, right. Now, you know what? They could say the same thing about our profession, about academics, right? How do you weed out those with damaging personalities? Yeah, right? I mean, the idea is that we're all the ones who are basically socially inept and can't actually work in the real world, so we go back to college and we just sort of stay there forever, right? That we really can't move on. And I'm not really sure there's a surefire way to weed those individuals out, right? I mean, and you think about it, like I said earlier, if you think about the job that law enforcement officers do, that's a certain type of personality. The same thing as an academic, that's a certain type of personality, right? And you want that kind of personality on some level. Folks who go in the military, I have all respect. I have a lot of members of my family who are military, right? But that's a certain type of personality. Now, some would say nowadays, unfortunately, it's getting a bad knock. It's if you can't graduate and go on anything else, you're going to the military. And I think that's sort of an improper sort of placement of saying, you have no other options, thus this is it, as opposed to this is almost, it could be the family business in some families, right? That's sort of what you do. And so, yeah, I think you can get to potentially better psychological testing potentially. But what I think more important is actually, rather than doing what's happened in the past, where you hear the scuttlebutt about what someone does and you ignore it. Or it's, that's part of what we do, right? Or that's routine. And I think it means you have to be more attuned for those who supervise to recognize behavior that may be going off track, right? Because the guy who shot the kid in Cleveland was a problem in his previous department, and they picked him up. That was something in which they pushed the problem on, right? I mean, and so you think about those, it's not about the fact that, and often it's not a first-time occurrence, right? There is something there that lends or that points to this person going down that path already that just needs to be recognized and dealt with by those who are in positions of power, and not just sort of pushing the problem along. I mean, these folks could say the same thing about the Catholic Church, right? Pushing the problem along, right? I mean, so it's not as though law enforcement is an institution in and of itself that has these problems. The problem becomes the folks who work in law enforcement have a very serious and a very deadly power at their disposal, which is different. As an academic, I'm not shooting anybody in my class when they don't do the reading, right? Or when they're talking back to me in class. That's not going to happen. If I'm on the street and I feel as though, and also, I don't have to make a split-second decision, right? I worked as a paralegal once, and they took us down to this Postal Service firing range, and they gave us one of these simulation things where, you have a 45 that's hooked up to like this computer screen, and the reaction time actually is a small window, right? To make that reaction. I mean, that's it's a tight window, right? So we need to recognize that too in the context. The question becomes, could something have been avoided in advance of that, right? Could that have been identified prior to that? And consider all the law enforcement officers who go through the jobs who don't shoot anybody, right? I mean, that outweighs the very high profile, right? And so you get that. So. New hand.
I was just going to ask, so
Sure.
a lot of what we do as planners is engage community dialogue.
Yep.
Trying to build that dialogue amongst community members. I was wondering if maybe you could speak to some strategies you might use in communities where this is a central, something that they deal with on a daily basis, and
Yeah.
communities where they don't. I'm thinking about where I come from out west.
Mm-hmm.
Race is really not something we have to confront day in and day out because we're predominantly majority race out in Montana, Wyoming. There's definitely not quite the diversity you experience in a lot of other places. So in both of those settings, it seems like you might adopt some different strategies. Do you have some suggestions on how we might be more successful in developing that community dialogue?
Different strategies for what?
In communities
Okay.
those scripts may not even actually have ever been formed because they, like you talked about your student that didn't have any
Mhm.
African American students in the classroom. I know there's a lot of folks out
Well, the script may still be there.
well, yeah.
Just because you haven't met somebody doesn't mean that you're not getting the message. And particularly nowadays with with our wonderful social media, with the 300 cable, stations on cable, you're getting the message from something, right? And it may not be as pronounced or it may not be as visible, but there's a message that's coming through, right? But also I would just add that there are other scripts that are operating, right? There could be issues about sexual orientation, right? Issues about gender. And so there are other things which may be playing themselves out. And so, I mean, part of that is is recognizing that there are going to be those visible those visible scripts, I would call them, those visible characters, and then those invisible ones, right? Which may exist, but which people don't have enough of a tipping point to basically be advocates for or to say something, and recognizing what may be the hidden populations in the populations in which you serve, right? I had a student who just came and did a disability talk at the law school the other day. And I found it very interesting, right? Because in 10 minutes, she taught me something that I was doing wrong, that I was doing not to serve my students with a disability. She put a video on for us to see, and she clicked the closed caption thing on it. And I've been teaching for 14 years, and it never crossed my mind that there might be students in the room who have difficulty hearing and or seeing who would benefit from reading the video, right? Seeing closed caption. And so it's overcoming our own biases. And it's recognizing that there may be issues that you are unaware of, right? And I think it's about sort of putting that and hearing from the community, and hearing from the community in both public and private spaces. Because often in public, folks who may have certain issues may not be willing to divulge because that may put them in jeopardy, right? And recognizing that you may have those kind of issues, right? And so I think it becomes that kind of a dialogue, right? Both making it public, also making it potentially anonymous, recognizing what folks sort of want, and realizing that there may be the invisible characteristics which you don't see, right? And things like that. Sure.
I had a follow-up question for you on living where you serve, because I think that it's probably a really compelling. I heard some disparate information about the training aspects, like a lot of the shoot, don't shoot,
Yeah.
and some people say it's actually sometimes more harmful. Some of the types of training that are happening. So my question was that I have a lot of firefighters in my family, not really in police, but many times they live somewhere else because they can't afford to live where they serve.
Right. That's a whole different, yes,
Right.
yes.
So my question is,
Huge
it's
issue.
not a decision,
Yeah, I
choice.
know. Yeah.
Is there any evidence, or if you're aware of anything where police sort of get involved in that and lobby for that becomes a
That they don't want to
within
live?
the city? No, that they because they're like workforce housing, or how much police
Yeah.
pressure others within city government to sort of be aware of that this is a necessity that we have people live here who can also live here.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't come across any sort of movements. I mean, I think the issue is complex, right? So there are folks who say, well, listen, I should be able to live where I want to live and work where I want to work,
Right.
and just because they're not in the same place, so what? I'm still doing my job, effectively wherever I am. The issue about sort of living where you work for those particular individuals is about building up rapport and sort of community dialogue and so forth. The question, of course, becomes, which is I think a little more deeper question, or not a little more deeper issue, is the lack of affordability for public servants to live where they serve, right? I mean, that's a more profound question, because you can still have a different kind of script operating, a socioeconomic status one, if you serve a gated community or a community that's incredibly wealthy and you can't live there. I mean, now you are viewed, and you are viewed as the servant who comes in and protects us and keeps our houses from burning down, right? I mean, I always look at the interesting cases of the wildfires in California, right? And all these $1 million homes, and it's like, I want to go back there. I can't believe these firemen aren't letting us back. And you're like, they're actually trying to save your life, right? And you're like, whoa, but I got to go back. And they're like, the reason why you've been locked out, the whole place is on fire, and you sort of like recognize that, but they then get treated as if they were servants, right? And not saying that servants should be treated poorly either, regardless of servants anyway, but it's that sort of interaction, right? Oh, you work for us kind of thing. Whereas I think you can't sort of deny that if you have the shifting dynamics, that if you have a poor or disadvantaged community and you have law enforcement, right, that status in itself is an elevating status, right? And you've got those issues which will sort of go head to head at some occasion. And the one thing you might have that makes you fundamentally different from the people you serve in disadvantaged communities is your status as a law enforcement officer, right? I mean, I think the issue becomes you need to make more mixed income in sort of affordable sort of areas, right? Which is a much more profound and, some would probably say, a socialist perspective, right? But I mean, the idea is that, look, I'm priced out of living in New York City. There's no way I can afford to go back and live where I used to live, right? I live in Columbia, Missouri. It's great, but it's those issues, right? We have priced out communities, and in some ways we have priced out diversity in communities, both economic status diversity, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, and those individuals who serve, right, who protect and serve, they are priced out, right? And so they have to travel now. I mean, consider the life of a law enforcement officer or firefighter who has to travel 40 minutes, 45 minutes from home to work, right? Well, they'd like to be home too with their kids and playing softball with their children too, just as everybody else would, right? And so we need to recognize that, and particularly that high stress kind of job, do you really want them having to add more stress? And so it adds all of that, right? Then there's of course the issue about wanting to live with others who are familiar, who look like you too, and should we basically be requiring folks not to do that, right? Because there's going to be the fundamental question. The state troopers in Missouri and other places have a big problem, right? They get state troopers in and they have to send them out to their first post, is where no one wants to go, right? But now they're beginning to certify legal permanent residents, non-citizens, because they're like, oh, they will go and set up families and bring families to these places where others may not, right? So it's finding different solutions to some of those things, but that's certainly a problem.
I know that my cousin was saying that even in this one jurisdiction, they can't take their vehicle out, so then they park them at firehouses. So the firefighters will drive 45 minutes,
right,
and then park the car, and then have to go. You know what I mean? So they just like leave.
Right. So yeah. So rather than allowing them an opportunity to either live there or whatever, we create mechanisms for them to sort of evade the rule, right? Which is like, is that really what we want to do? Them spending their time doing? You know, doing those kind of things. So.
If you did a GIS map of New York City showing where police officers live,
yeah,
would you see a big arc there of the Staten Island and Bensonhurst and Canarsie, or all these places?
Staten Island, Queens, probably probably some even in New Jersey.
Yeah. Meaning that, and they're then commuting into.
They're commuting in, or if they're lucky enough, if they're in Staten Island and Queens, they may be working in jurisdictions or police precincts that are close or nearby, kind of thing. I mean, I remember when I grew up, there were some law enforcement officers who actually lived in some of the housing projects, you know, because they were still mixed income, right? They weren't the image we get now, or what is sort of perpetrated as sort of the negative imagery, right? I mean, housing projects they got a bad name once we started sort of making them bad, right? When we sort of said, we're going to take away services, we're going to do all these things. That's not what they are. I mean, they are communities, right? I mean, they are communities of individuals, and so once we started doing that, we started removing those. We started moving those sort of elements, I think.
I thought Oakland and Berkeley were trying out some of the cops living within the.
Oh, they might be.
I think they're doing some
Yeah.
experiments. It might be worth looking into that and seeing how that's working.
Yeah.
Although I know there's a lot of distrust regardless of the police, regardless of race within Oakland, frankly, and given some of the behavior.
But if you saw a law enforcement officer or police officer on a daily basis, and you got to know that person, right? That might change things. One of the things I found was interesting. So I teach at this alternative school in Columbia. Also, I do a street law class, and there's a law enforcement officer there, right? They've got a metal detector there, and when I talked to the students about what happened in Ferguson, they were like, "Oh yeah, you know, so-and-so officer came in and he talked to us, and we get to know this person, and they engage with us, and we sort of know them personally." And then what was curious, they said, but whenever we're outside this building, it's like they don't know us. It's like they don't know us and we don't know them, right? So law enforcement don't want to see other law enforcement basically engaging in relationships, and their friends don't want to see them, right? The whole snitching code, right? There becomes this issue of you've got this competing narratives that are basically preventing better relationships, right? So it's not just the historical, the contemporary, but it's also these very sort of anti-relationships, right? Oh, well, you're hanging out with so-and-so, you must be snitching, right? Or you're dealing with these kids, are you sort of becoming too soft, right? And so you're overcoming two different cultural clashes at the same time. So the living there might be better because now you know, oh, well, that's Officer so-and-so who lives, or Tom, not Officer, you know, that's who lives right there with his wife and kids or whatever, right?
Well, that was very
Well, thanks a lot.
interesting. Thank
Appreciate
you
it.
very much.
Sure.